All right. On to the fourth Sunday of August, which our theme for this month is a pause for guidance. And this comes within our 2021 theme of timeless wisdom, evolutionary vision. And when I think about a pause for guidance, what comes to mind for me is a time to rest, some reflection, and perhaps even some regeneration for what comes next. It's an opportunity to go within and to seek divine presence. And if all this technology works, I'm going to share one quote from Science of Mind that Ernest Holmes gave us. And that is that we have discovered that which the great, the good, and the wise have sung about and thought about, the imprisoned splendor within yourself and within each other, and have direct contact with it. And I think part of what Ernest is pointing to there is some of the same stuff that Jan was talking about in that great meditation this morning that took us to that special place. It's something that we have discovered, and is available to us at any time. So far this month, Reverend Sunshine has talked to us about a time for a tune-up, and that seems certainly appropriate when we look at this pausing for guidance. Reverend Kevin led us through a path of playful pause, a way that we can enjoy that refreshingness of gathering and playing together. And then last week, Reverend Sunshine showed us how a spark of imagination can give us new insights into our journey. And this week, I have the opportunity of exploring GPS, our guidance positioning system, or as some would say, our God positioning system. And I like this analogy because the GPS takes something that most of us are familiar with in one form or another, and it sheds light on the way that we can look into some of our Science of Mind practices. And just for the purpose of distinction, I'm going to refer to this as our inner GPS, because I would also like to talk for just a couple minutes about our external GPS. And that is this wonderful scientific thing that we know of as our global positioning system, which was initially developed for guidance systems. And I got to thinking about that and was going, gee, what is the most elementary and primary purpose for this global positioning system? Well, those of us who use GPS on our smartphones might say, oh, it's so that I can get directions to go where I'm going. And yes, absolutely, that's true. But I think the most fundamental thing when we look at why that whole system was set up, it's to tell us where we are right now. And it's the basis for getting those directions. Because once we have the coordinates of knowing where we are, then we can go into our apps, whether it's Google Maps or, I tend to use Waze. And if I open up that app, there'll be a little blue dot that will appear right over my house because that's where I am today. And if I want to go somewhere else, like maybe the Sawdust Festival in Laguna Beach, which is going on right now, then I could go into Waze and I could tell Waze that's where I want to go. And Waze would figure out the coordinates of Laguna Beach, and it would then create the directions for me to go there. And I think that's just a marvelous thing that we can hold that in our hands and have that kind of direction. And one of the kind of side benefits of all that is that, those of us who have GPS, if we choose, we can have that direction, those directions spoken to us by, a voice within our phones. And I've changed mine around several times, but at the moment, my iPhone happens to have a British female voice. And it's kind of funny to drive along and have this voice go, in the next quarter mile, turn to the right. And I find that just, after hearing some of the regular ones, I kind of enjoy that. And in fact, we have this street that runs from Yorba Linda through Fullerton that is named, by the locals, we call it Bassenturi. and it has a silent T in it. And the first time that I had the GPS set up to go somewhere, it comes on and she goes, "Turn left on Bastanchery." And so I kind of had to chuckle a little bit because I think that makes the ride a little bit more fun. But what happens in using our GPS? What happens if we make a wrong turn somewhere? What does the GPS do for us? Well, it gives us feedback so that we can make course corrections. All right, so I think you see where this is going. And our internal GPS works much in the same way. It can help us understand where we are right now spiritually. When we choose a destination, it can guide us along that chosen path. It can offer us course corrections when we stray from that current path. And when we connect to our internal GPS, we can quite often use one of what I'm going to talk today of as 3 of our various meditative spiritual practices that we can connect with when we connect to this GPS. And one of those, and Reverend Kevin just mentioned it, that we're going to do this afternoon, and that is visioning. And visioning is where when we achieve a meditative state, we ask a question, looking for what Spirit brings to mind. And in this process, we open ourselves up by asking this question and then waiting to see what impressions we get from Spirit. And we write those down as we get them, unfiltered. We don't go through and edit at that point. And then we go back and we see out of those impressions what was Spirit speaking to us. Another one that we use is one that's called visualization. And visualization is very different from visioning, where in visioning, we ask this question. In visualization, it's about forming a mental picture of the desired outcome that we want and taking that into meditation. Ernest Holmes calls this creating a mental equivalent. And God bless Ernest for all of his terminologies. He really does come up with them. But he thought this was so important that he devoted an entire chapter in the Science of Mind text to mental equivalence. And if I can get to slide 2 here, we'll see what Ernest had to say about that. All right, so here's what Ernest said about this. He said, "Our individual use of it can only equal our individual capacity to understand it, to embody it. We cannot demonstrate beyond our ability to provide a mental equivalent of our desire." And so what he's talking about here is being able to really focus in on this idea of creating our mental equivalent. And when we do that, we bring this picture into meditation, and this becomes the thing that we give life to, that we bring some real thought and real passion to bear on this particular item. And that is what we give to Spirit to work with. And then the third one is just a meditation that I sort of think of as without an agenda, simply communing with the divine, a time to simply be and to let the busyness of the day subside for a while. And if you've been around when I've done some of the meditations in service before, you'll be familiar with what I call the I am the mountain meditation. And this is the one where we say, I am the mountain, the sky is my consciousness, and the clouds are my thoughts passing by. And the whole purpose of this particular meditation is to be that mountain and to be able to know that those clouds are our thoughts, that we have those thoughts, but they're not us. We are not our thoughts. To be able to recognize that separation between the thoughts and us, and that we have the freedom to be in that sky, in that space of simply being with the divine. And we put aside all else that's going on by letting those thoughts pass by. So just like an external GPS, the signal from our internal GPS is there all the time. We use our various spiritual meditation practices to access all the features and what I think of as the settings. And we can receive guidance, though, throughout the day in the form of those little do this, not that type of feelings. Those are little nudges that, if we're paying attention, they help point us in a more helpful direction. I know that this internal GPS, which I know as my internal guidance system, has actually been with me for a long time, even before I knew Science of Mind. And it has led me in many different directions, and I think has saved me from making some colossal mistakes in life. But it's that thing that literally just gives us those nudges, those hints of direction, if you will, that move us in a particular way. So we've looked at how our internal GPS resembles our external and several ways that we can connect with it. But what I'd like to look at now are some of the details that can make our use of the internal GPS and our spiritual practices more effective. It's kind of maybe think of it as an under the hood look, or perhaps behind the scenes. And what I want to start with, and you'll have to bear with this for a moment, but this comes from the news this week as I was watching all of this horrible stuff going on in Afghanistan. There was a news program on where the host was talking to several of the commentators. And he asked one of them, he said, how is it that we could have this kind of ragtag group of people, about 75,000, completely take over a country with a population of over 37 million people, and have a government-backed security force of over 300,000 that was trained and supplied by the United States? You know, and just thinking of that before we even get to the next part of this is just somewhat overwhelming. And the commentator said, well, he said the Taliban had a deep conviction to their Islamic faith and how the world should be. Now, we may not agree with that, and I certainly don't, so don't hear this as being any way praising the Taliban. But what he then said was that the government forces had been together for a short time. They had no real passionate unifying force that was worth fighting for. And so the Taliban had this deep conviction for 20 years and maybe earlier, and the government forces didn't. And so when they were confronted by this small group of people, relatively, they laid down their arms and surrendered. And so I look at that and I think that has something for us as practitioners and students of Science of Mind. And that is that we need to bring this sense of deep conviction to our Science of Mind work, whether it's in affirmations, whether it's in treatments, whether it's, just in any types of our meditation. Because Ernest Holmes maintains in various places throughout the Science of Mind text that thoughts alone are not sufficient to produce the results that we desire. So our prayers and affirmations must be accompanied by a deep sense of feeling. He likened this to the biblical idea that faith without works is dead. And he said that the equivalent to that is that treatments without a deep sense of conviction are relatively ineffective. And so here's what Ernest said. Let's go take a look at slide number 3 here. He says, the thought is a mold. Conviction is the molten substance poured into this mold. One is not complete without the other. And many people make the mistake of using only one of these essential states of consciousness. I want to say that one again because this one really speaks to me. The thought is a mold, but conviction is the molten substance that's poured into that mold. One is not complete without the other. And many people make the mistake of using only one of these essential states of consciousness. And I see that as just one of the most fundamental ideas that we can have in all of our spiritual practices. You know, when we think about pouring this molten substance into a mold, you know, it sort of takes me back to one of our trips to Hawaii when we were at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park and watching the molten lava as it flowed down and into the sea. And we know that this molten lava becomes solid rock. And I think that gives us some indication of when we take this passion, this deep sense of feeling into our work, it brings the manifestations to us. So in the same fashion, our prayers and our affirmations become highly effective when accompanied by a passionate desire and a profound connection with the divine. We need to bring this deep sense of feeling to bear on what we are seeking to change in one of these aspects of our lives. And another slide here, Ernest will tell us about how important this is. He says, we must relight the torch of our imagination by fire caught from heaven. We must remain faithful to this vision, for a realization of the presence of God is the secret power of our work. And notice how Ernest talks about the torch of imagination and the presence of God, bringing both of those together, and how important that is in our work. And this even harkens back to Reverend Sunshine's talk last week when she spoke about the spark of imagination. And we know that it only takes a spark to ignite a fire, or in this case, a torch. And here, Ernest is telling us the power in the torch is essential to our spiritual work. When we create a mental equivalent and meditate on it with the expectation of it manifesting what we desire, we need to infuse it with that deep, passionate feeling. The same is true in our affirmations. We must affirm our truth with an unwavering faith. And in our prayers, our spiritual mind treatments, nothing less is required than the fire of our conviction. Ernest Holmes confirms that power of conviction coupled with our faith in spirit in this quote from the Science of Mind text. He says, after using whatever words will bring conviction to our thought, we pause and try to realize the presence of the all-power from which every special good comes. This is adding the spirit to the letter of the law. However, we should never forget that both the letter and the spirit are necessary in our work. And what Ernest is talking about here is that same idea that the thought is the mold and the molten substance gets put in. One of them originates. I sort of think of this as a left brain, right brain kind of thing, where in the left brain, we form the thought, we form the ideas, we do the analysis. And then the right brain is that part where we have that deep sense of intuition, that deep sense of spirit, where we then bring those two together. And then the universe takes over and brings that into being. So, some questions for us to consider. What do you do to give yourself a break and feel closer to spirit? I know each of us has our different ways, and with our lives being so busy and hectic, they can become really, really involved. And I know that sometimes I get so involved that I can forget that that quiet place within is available as a place of peace and refuge. I do know that for me, I find that sitting down with my headphones and some soothing music to help quiet my mind brings me closer to the divine. And it also helps me to remember that all of those thoughts running around in my head are just the clouds passing by my mountain and the limitless sky above. So, what can you do to ignite the power of conviction in your spiritual work? It is worth considering that this week as you go about your life. So, what I would say is take time to log into your internal GPS. I like to think of it as a spiritual app that is free for us to use at any time we choose, and to know that doing so regularly will help keep us, and in the busyness of life, in the proper perspective, to ground us in our spiritual life. And so, let me just ask that we conclude this with a little time of centering prayer. So I would ask you to either close your eyes or have a light gaze and just join me in a time where we can just acknowledge this spirit, this power, this presence that surrounds us, that lives its life through and as each and every one of us. And it is that which creates. It is that which allows us to take thoughts and bring them into being through this power of taking that thought, pouring in the molten substance, and allowing the universe to manifest that in our thoughts. What an amazing idea. And it is there for our use. And so what I know today is that as we contemplate using that spiritual practice, that we know to bring that fire along with it, to bring that passion to bear, and to watch how Spirit takes that and brings things into our life. And so for right now, I just give thanks for knowing those truths, for knowing all that Spirit is capable of doing. How marvelous it is. And so now I will release this into that creative law, pouring this molten substance into that, knowing that it becomes manifest just as I've spoken it. And so I release this now into that law and just simply say, and so it is, and now it is.